There are stories that live in the dust of a nation's roads. They are not written in books of history, but are whispered by the wind that rattles the palm leaves, carried in the memories of the land itself. In the early 19th century, the Indian subcontinent was a world in motion. It was a vast, uncertain space, a tapestry woven with the paths of pilgrims seeking gods, merchants chasing fortunes, and soldiers marching for an empire they barely understood. On these arteries of travel, under a relentless sun, a man was never truly alone, yet never truly safe. Entire caravans, brimming with life and commerce, would set out from Agra or Delhi and simply vanish. They would dissolve into the landscape, their journey ending not at a destination, but in a register book, beside the chillingly mundane phrase, misadventure. No bodies were found. No witnesses came forward. There was only a spreading silence, a creeping dread that haunted the wayside groves and the lonely encampments. It was a fear that had a name, a word from the Hindi verb thagna, to deceive. It spoke of a brotherhood, a secret religion of murder, that turned the smiling face of a fellow traveller into the last thing you ever saw. Before the roads, before the empire, before the men with their silken cords, there was the story. And all stories, if you follow them back far enough, begin with the gods. To understand the men who called themselves thugs, we must first understand the goddess they called Mother. We must travel into the heart of Hindu cosmology, a universe of breathtaking complexity, where time is not a straight line but a vast repeating circle, and the forces of creation and destruction are locked in an eternal, necessary dance. At the heart of this cosmos is the Trimurti, a trinity of supreme divinity. Brahma, the creator who dreams the universe into being, Vishnu, the preserver who maintains its cosmic order, and Shiva, the destroyer, whose role is not one of evil, but of transformation. Shiva's destruction is a cleansing fire, the necessary end that makes way for a new beginning, the tearing down of a universe grown old so that Brahma may create it anew. It is in this concept, destruction as a vital, even merciful act, that we find the seed of our story. But alongside these male deities exists a power that is arguably even more fundamental, Shakti. She is the divine feminine, the active, primordial energy of the universe itself. She is creation, change, and power personified. The great goddesses of Hinduism are all manifestations of this singular, awesome force. She can be Parvati, the gentle and benevolent consort of Shiva, Lakshmi, the radiant goddess of fortune, or Saraswati, the patron of wisdom and art. But when the cosmic order is threatened by forces that even the gods cannot vanquish, Shakti can manifest in her most terrifying and ferocious form. She becomes Kali. Kali is the goddess of time, change, and death. Her name itself means she who is black, or she who is death. But this is not the blackness of nothingness. It is the limitless void of space and time from which all things are born and to which all things must return. Her iconography is designed to shock the viewer out of complacency. She is often depicted naked, symbolizing that she is beyond all artifice, beyond the illusory veil of the material world. Around her neck is a garland of 50 human heads, representing the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, the origin of sound and knowledge. Her skirt is made of severed human arms, for she unburdens her devotees from the bonds of karma, the endless cycle of action and consequence. In one hand, she holds a bloody sword, cutting through doubt and ego. In another, she holds the severed head of a demon, a symbol of the liberated soul. She is terrifying because she is truth stripped of all comfort. She is the storm that clears the air, the forest fire that allows new growth. She is the fierce, unconditional love of a mother who will destroy what threatens her children, even if that threat is their own ignorance. She is not a demon to be feared, but a fundamental reality of existence to be faced. It was this vision of the divine, raw, untamable, and drenched in a terrifying love, that a group of killers would twist into a charter for murder. Their sacred history begins within one of the great Hindu texts, the Devi Mahatmyam. It tells of a time when the world was overrun by a demon of impossible power, a titan named Raktabija. His name meant blood seed, and it was a literal curse. For every drop of his blood that touched the earth, a perfect new copy of himself would spring into being. The gods sent their armies against him, but every wound they inflicted only multiplied their enemy. The battlefield became an ever-expanding ocean of demons, and the forces of order were on the verge of being drowned. In desperation, the goddess Durga, a warrior manifestation of Shakti, concentrated all of her divine fury. From the darkness of her own brow, an emanation of her rage burst forth. This was Kali, born for a singular, horrific purpose. Yet even she could not simply slaughter Raktabija. The problem of the blood remained. A new method was needed, one that was bloodless, clean, and absolute. And so, the legend tells us, Kali created her own assistants. From the sweat of her brow, she formed two men. She gave them a length of yellow silk, a rumel torn from the hem of her celestial garment, and taught them the art of strangulation. As the goddess's own vast tongue shot out to lap up every drop of the demon's blood before it could touch the earth, her two human servants moved through the demonic horde. They were silent, efficient, their nooses tightening around the necks of Raktabija's children, killing them without spilling a single world-spawning drop. When the last demon was slain and the cosmic balance restored, Kali gave her human servants their eternal charter. They and their descendants were to be her chosen instruments on earth. Their sacred duty, their holy profession, their dharma, would be to continue this act of ritual strangulation. Their victims, she decreed, would be a continuous sacrifice to keep her divine hunger sated, to prevent her from rising to devour all of mankind in a final apocalyptic rage. They were to be the thugs. But their story contains a flaw, a curse born of human curiosity. As the goddess worked, one of the original thugs dared to look back, witnessing her divine form as she disposed of the corpses. No mortal was meant to see such a thing. Kali, in a moment of mercy, spared his life, but declared her divine protection was now compromised. Henceforward, she proclaimed, you must take your own measures for the concealment of the bodies of those whom you destroy. It will not always be effectual, and will often lead to your detection by earthly powers, and in this will consist your punishment. From that moment on, the thugs were bound to the earth, forced to dig graves for their victims, leaving a trail, however faint, that could one day be followed. They were a priesthood tasked with murder, a holy brotherhood forever haunted by the practical realities of their work. This is the supernatural charter, the secret history that animated the men who walked the roads of 19th century India. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as priests, essential cogs in the cosmic machine. Their double lives, as virtuous farmers and family men on one hand, and as ritual killers on the other, were not a mark of hypocrisy, but of sacred and terrible duty. And so, the myth leaves the heavens and steps onto the dusty earth, where the smiling face of a new friend could be the face of a goddess's love or a killer's deception. The hunt is about to begin. The true weapon of the thug was not the silk scarf, the rumel. It was trust. Their art was not murder, but the meticulous, patient and soul-chilling performance of friendship. They were, as their name proclaimed, the Deceivers, and their method was a masterpiece of psychological predation. A thug gang was not a disorganized band of robbers. It was a highly specialized unit, a living machine where every part had its function, honed over generations. The operation began with the Sotha, or the inveigler. He was the scout, the advance agent, often the most charming and disarming man in the gang. His role was to loiter in the marketplaces, the inns, the public squares, listening for news of travellers, assessing their wealth, and identifying a potential target. He was the first point of contact, the friendly face who would approach a caravan and suggest they travel together for safety, an offer few on the perilous roads of India would refuse. This wasn't just about finding wealthy travellers, it was a process of casting the perfect victims. The Sotha was a master of reading people, looking for specific vulnerabilities. A merchant travelling a route for the first time, a family that seemed overly trusting, or a small group whose members appeared physically weak. This adds a layer of cold, predatory calculation, showing how they actively selected victims who were least likely to fight back or be missed quickly. Once the Sotha had made his introduction, the rest of the gang would begin its insidious infiltration. They would never join all at once. That would arouse suspicion. Instead, they would appear on the road in small groups of 2 or 3 at staggered intervals over the course of days, even weeks. They would feign being strangers to one another, acknowledging their fellow thugs with only the most subtle of signs. To their victims, it seemed only that their travelling party was growing naturally, a welcome development. But with each new addition, the balance of power shifted, until, unbeknownst to the travellers, the predators outnumbered the prey. During this long journey, the thugs would weave a web of false camaraderie. They shared their food. They helped with the animals. They sang songs around the campfire and told stories of their homes and families. They became friends, brothers of the road. Some were so adept at this deception that they would even pretend to convert to the religion of their targets, praying alongside them, learning their customs, all to deepen the bond of trust. Some of the most successful thug gangs were masters of long-term infiltration. It wasn't always a matter of days. Accounts tell of thugs travelling with a target for weeks or even months, slowly and methodically earning their absolute trust. They would protect the travellers from actual dangers, like common bandits, further cementing their role as friends and guardians, all while planning the perfect moment to strike. This emphasises their terrifying patience and the profound depth of their betrayal. The campfire itself was a tool for meticulous intelligence gathering, disguised as friendly chatter. A thug would ask seemingly innocent questions like, "Where is your home?" This wasn't just small talk. It was to gauge how far away the victim's family was and how long it would take for them to realise he was missing. "Do you have children? A wife waiting?" This helped them understand the social ties and the likelihood of a search party being organised. Is this your first time on the road to Delhi? An experienced traveller might be more suspicious or have allies along the way. A novice was a safer target. This turns the seemingly friendly campfire into a chilling, unnoticed interrogation. And all the while, they would be speaking a language the travellers could not understand. It was called Ramasi, a secret jargon, a criminal argot designed to allow the thugs to communicate and conspire in plain sight. To the victims, it was just chatter. But for those who knew the code, every word was laden with deadly intent. A discussion about the weather could be a plan for an ambush. An innocent inquiry about a traveller's destination was, in fact, an assessment of his wealth. A rich-looking merchant was not a man. He was a sarkar, a term of respect, twisted into a mark of death. The leader might look at the moon and say to his confederate, "Dil Luna, give me the moon." It was not poetry. It was the order to prepare for the strangulation. The audience, made privy to this secret tongue, becomes an unwilling participant in the conspiracy, watching with a growing, helpless dread as the victims laugh and talk with the very men who are calmly discussing their murder. Before an expedition could even begin, the most crucial omen was taken. The gang would go to a deserted place outside their village and wait, sometimes for days, for the pilherna, the call of a specific creature, like a jackal or an owl, coming from the left side. If the sound came from the right, it was a bad omen. If they heard nothing, they could not proceed. This wasn't just superstition. It was a core part of their operational security. The act of grown men sitting in absolute silence for days on end, waiting for a bird to cry before they can embark on a season of murder, is a deeply unsettling and cinematic image. This meticulous planning, however, was subject to a power beyond their own. The thugs were profoundly superstitious, their every action governed by a complex system of omens, which they believed were direct communications from the goddess Kali. They were not acting on their own volition. They were merely following her divine script. The cry of a particular bird, the sight of a certain animal, the way a lizard chirped in the night. These were all portents to be interpreted by the gang's spiritual expert. A favourable omen, like the ululation of lizards, called Baramuti, gave them the divine sanction to proceed. An unfavourable one, the sound of fighting cats, Kali Kimanj, or the sight of a fox, a sewali, crossing their path from the wrong direction, was a divine prohibition. An entire expedition, weeks or months in the making, could be abandoned in an instant if the omens were not right. This absolute faith in supernatural guidance removed the burden of decision from their shoulders. The choice to kill was not theirs. It was Kali's. While the Sothas were befriending their victims, another member of the gang, the Luga, had often already gone ahead. His task was to scout the road and identify the perfect place for the slaughter. This place was called a baile, a secluded grove, a lonely stretch of road, or a dry riverbed, far from any village or patrol. The Luga would prepare the site, sometimes even digging the mass grave in advance, a pit waiting in the wilderness for bodies it had not yet received. Now, all the pieces are in place. The gang has achieved numerical superiority. They have won the complete trust of their victims. The travellers are relaxed, their guards down, camped for the night at a bile, chosen by the Luga. The omens have been consulted and found favourable. The men sit around the fire, the air filled with the sounds of crickets and quiet conversation. The thug leader surveys the scene. His men are in position, each one standing or sitting near his assigned target. The moment has come. He catches the eye of his chief lieutenants. He does not speak. He does not need to. He gives the signal. It might be a common phrase, like, "bring the tobacco." Or it might be a simple, unobtrusive gesture. It is the journey, the signal for death. A silent command passes through the firelight, unheard and unseen by the men who are about to die. In the quiet of the Indian night, the trap has just been sprung. There is a terrible intimacy in the Thuggee method of murder. It is not the impersonal violence of a bullet or a blade, but a close, physical, and chillingly silent act. At the signal of the jinni, the quiet camaraderie of the campfire explodes into a perfectly coordinated, brutally efficient slaughter. The butotes, the designated stranglers, move as one. They work in teams of 3. One thug, positioned behind the victim, instantly throws the rumal, a long silk scarf or a turban sash, around the man's neck. Sometimes a large silver coin, a rupee, was sewn into the cloth, turning it into a weighted weapon that, when cast with expert sleight, would strike the victim's larynx, crushing the airway and preventing any cry for help. Simultaneously, a second thug grabs the victim's legs, sweeping him off his feet, while a third pushes his head forward to increase the pressure of the noose. It is over in moments. There is no struggle, no sound, and most importantly, no blood. The prohibition against the shedding of blood was the strongest rule of their brotherhood, a direct commandment from Kali, born of the myth of the demon Raktabija. To kill with the rumal was to perform the act as the goddess had first taught their ancestors. It was clean, sacred murder. This wasn't a brutish act of choking. Sleeman's records describe a chilling anatomical precision. The thugs knew exactly how to twist the rumal to place a large hard knot, called the bichun, directly against the side of the neck, compressing carotid artery and jugular vein. This induced unconsciousness in seconds, before the victim even knew what was happening. It was a practiced scientific method of killing that was both silent and terrifyingly efficient. The murder itself was a coordinated team effort with a clear hierarchy. The butotes were the elite stranglers. Below them were the shumsiers, or holders, whose job was to expertly grab the victim's hands or legs at the precise moment the rumal was thrown, preventing any struggle. This reinforces the idea of the gang as a living machine, where every member had a specific, rehearsed role in the act of slaughter. While the stranglers complete their grim work, another ritual begins. The lugers, the gravediggers, step forward with their sacred tool, the kussi, or consecrated pickaxe. This was no ordinary implement. Forged, according to their law, from one of Kali's own teeth, it was an object of immense religious power. It was entrusted only to the most sober, reliable, and respected member of the gang. The thugs believed that an oath sworn upon the kusei was the most powerful and binding in existence, more sacred than one sworn on the Quran or the waters of the Ganges. To lie upon the kusei was to invite a swift and terrible death, your head turning backwards on your neck as the goddess enacted her vengeance. The ritual surrounding the sacred pickaxe was one of immense reverence and fear. It was never allowed to be handled by a junior member, and it was consecrated anew before each expedition. Before digging the mass grave, the lead gravedigger would draw a circle on the ground with the tip of the kusi, whispering a prayer to Kali to sanctify the spot and ask her permission to inter the sacrifices. This turns the gruesome task of digging a grave into a solemn, religious ceremony. With this holy instrument, they dig the mass grave, the bill. The act of burial was itself a prescribed rite. Once the victims were stripped of their valuables, their bodies were prepared for their unhallowed rest. The thugs would systematically break all of the major joints in the corpse's limbs. This had a practical purpose. It hastened decomposition and prevented the buildup of gases that could cause the earth above the grave to swell, attracting the unwanted attention of scavenging jackals or wild animals. But like everything they did, this grim mutilation was part of the ritual. After breaking the joints, some gangs would systematically slice open the abdomens of their victims before burial. This juxtaposition of a sacred murder with a grotesque, almost clinical post-mortem procedure is profoundly disturbing. The bodies were then thrown into the pit and buried, face down. A final act of desecration before the earth was smoothed over, leaving almost no trace of the horror that had just occurred. Even in their sanctified slaughter, the thugs operated under a peculiar code of ethics, a set of divine prohibitions that dictated who was an acceptable sacrifice for Kali and who was not. They were forbidden from killing women, for all women were considered incarnations of the goddess herself. They were not to harm Brahmins, whose spiritual purity made them unworthy sacrifices, nor the sick or maimed. Certain professions were also protected. Musicians, dancers, oil vendors, carpenters, and blacksmiths were to be spared. But the chaos of the road often blurred these sacred lines. The presence of a wife travelling with her merchant husband created a dangerous witness. In the cold calculus of survival, the divine rule was often broken, and women were strangled alongside their men to protect the secrecy of the brotherhood. The division of plunder was also a ritual that ensured the gang's survival. A portion was always set aside for religious offerings. Another was reserved for the families of any thugs who had been killed or captured on previous expeditions. Most importantly, a significant share was often paid as tribute to the zemindar, or local landowner or headman, of the thug's home village. This payment wasn't just a bribe. It was a way of making the entire community complicit in the crimes, ensuring their silence and protection from outside authorities. This expands the conspiracy from a single gang to a whole social ecosystem built on murder. With the bodies buried and the plunder gathered, the final and most important ritual could take place. A portion of the loot was always set aside as an offering to the goddess, a tithe for her divine favour. Then, the gang would gather for the ceremony of Tupani. This was their sacrament, their communion. A portion of coarse, unrefined sugar, known as gur, was consecrated in Kali's name. The thugs would then partake of this sacred sweet. This act was the psychological key to their existence. It was a ritual designed to purge them of any lingering humanity, any flicker of remorse. As the infamous thug approver Ferringhere later confessed to his British captors, the gur was transformative. We all feel pity sometimes, he admitted, but the gur of the Tupani changes our nature. It would change the nature of a horse. Let any man once taste of that gur, and he will be a thug, though he know all the trades and have all the wealth in the world. The ceremony is complete. The graves are hidden, the loot is divided, the sacrament has been taken. The thugs, their souls cleansed of pity, their actions sanctified by ritual, melt back into the landscape. They might rejoin the road as pilgrims, or return to their villages to resume their lives as farmers and family men. There is no guilt, no fear of damnation. They are serene, secure in the knowledge that they are not murderers, but servants of a divine will, performing a necessary cosmic function. For the victims, there is only the silence of the grave. For the thugs, there is only the road ahead, and the endless promise of more work to be done in their goddess's name. Empires are built on knowledge. To rule a land, you must first understand it, map it, and categorize it. In the early 1830s, the British East India Company was the master of India, yet it was haunted by a ghost in its own machine. Reports trickled in from magistrates across the northern and central provinces of a persistent, baffling problem. Travellers, merchants, and even the company's own sepoys were disappearing in staggering numbers. As many as 40,000 people a year were vanishing without a trace. Yet the crimes were perfect, leaving no witnesses, no bodies, and no evidence. The British were faced with an information panic, a terrifying awareness of their own ignorance about the vast, violent subcontinent they claimed to control. They were fighting an enemy they could not see. Into this void stepped one man, Captain William Henry Sleeman, an officer in the Bengal Army who transferred to the civil service. Sleeman was a new kind of colonial administrator, methodical, obsessive, and possessed of a formidable intellect. Where others saw disparate acts of banditry, Sleeman saw a pattern. He became convinced that he was not dealing with common criminals, but with a single, ancient, and diabolical conspiracy. A pan-Indian secret society of ritual murderers. He called it Thuggee. To his superiors, his theories seemed fantastical, the product of an overactive imagination. But Sleeman was relentless. He saw himself as a solitary Englishman waging war against a hideous mystery, and he would not be deterred. His persistence paid off. He found a powerful ally in the Governor-General of India, Lord William Bentinck, a man committed to social reform and the imposition of British order. With Bentinck's backing, Sleeman was finally given the resources to begin his hunt. In 1835, the Thuggee and Dacoity Department was officially established, a special police force with a single, terrifying mandate: to eradicate this unseen enemy from the face of India. Sleeman was appointed its first superintendent. Sleeman knew that conventional policing would fail. How do you prosecute a crime with no witnesses, no bodies, and no complaints from the victims' families, who often never even knew what had become of their loved ones? A new legal weapon was needed. It came in the form of Act 30 of 1836. This groundbreaking and infamous piece of legislation made it a crime, punishable by imprisonment for life with hard labour, to simply belong to a gang of thugs. Proof of participation in a specific murder was no longer required. Association itself was now the crime. With this legal framework in place, Sleeman unleashed his most brilliant and controversial tactic, the approver system, or King's evidence. He understood that the thugs' greatest strength, their secret, interconnected brotherhood, was also their greatest vulnerability. He began to offer captured thugs a deal. Confess everything, name every member of your gang, reveal all the secrets of your trade, and you will be spared the gallows. For men facing certain death, it was an irresistible offer. The breakthrough came with the capture of a notorious thug leader known as Ferringhere. Under Sleeman's interrogation, Ferringhere turned approver. He began to talk, and the secrets of the Thuggee, hidden for centuries, came pouring out. He described the rituals, the omens, the secret language of Ramesses. Crucially, he named names, dozens of them. And he offered something more: proof. He agreed to lead Sleeman's men to the graves. This was the moment of truth for Sleeman's campaign. Approvers were marched under guard across hundreds of miles of countryside, pointing out the secluded spots, the baileys, where they had buried their victims. Sleeman's officers, accompanied by local magistrates, began to dig. The earth gave up its dead. At one site, they unearthed 100 bodies, just as Ferringhere had described. The approvers' confessions were no longer just stories. They were verifiable facts, backed by the grim physical evidence of the victims themselves. The system was working. Jails began to fill with accused thugs, and the approvers' testimony, now corroborated by the discovery of the bodies, was enough to secure convictions. Between 1831 and 1837 alone, over 3,000 thugs were captured. More than 400 were hanged. The rest were transported for life or imprisoned. One captured thug, a man named Behram, confessed to having been present at 931 murders and to having personally strangled at least 125 people with his rumal. But Sleeman's genius was not just in prosecution, it was in systematization. He was a pioneer of criminal intelligence. He didn't just listen to the confessions, he recorded them, cross-referenced them, and compiled them into massive, detailed volumes, like his Ramasiana, a dictionary of the thug's secret language. He meticulously constructed genealogical trees, tracking thug families through generations, ensuring no one could escape the net. And, most powerfully, he began to map the crime. He ordered large-scale maps of the Indian provinces and, as his approvers confessed to each murder, he had a clerk make a mark on the map at the location of the bell. For the first time, the invisible enemy was made visible. The hunt was over. The scale of the slaughter was finally, terrifyingly known. Or was it? The story, it seems, is complete. A hero has faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Captain William Henry Sleeman, the solitary Englishman, brought an entire system of ritualized murder to its knees. The roads of India were made safe. The cult of Kali was exposed and shattered. The black ink on Sleeman's map stands as a testament to his triumph, a final damning ledger of a conquered evil. This is the story that was celebrated in the halls of Parliament, the story that echoed through the drawing rooms of London, the story that solidified the moral authority of the British Empire. It is clean, it is heroic, and it is, very likely, the most masterful deception of all. To find the real story, we must leave the dusty roads of India and enter the quiet, climate-controlled archives of the modern world. Here, in the late 20th century, a new generation of historians began a different kind of hunt. Armed not with guns and legal acts, but with critical analysis, scholars like Martien van Werkens and Kim A. Wagner looked back at Sleeman's own records, at the very confessions that built his legend, and they began to see the ghost in the machine. They asked a question so profound it threatened to unravel the entire narrative. What if the Thuggee cult, as the world knew it, never really existed? Their work does not suggest the roads were safe, nor that men were not being murdered for their valuables. The terror was real. But the reason for it, they argue, was born of something far more mundane and far more tragic than a bloodthirsty goddess. Kim Wagner points to the world outside the Thuggee narrative, to the immense political and economic turmoil of early 19th century India. The old Mughal Empire had crumbled, and the armies of local princes had been defeated and disbanded by the relentlessly expanding East India Company. This created a crisis of demobilization. Tens of thousands of professional soldiers, men trained for nothing but combat, were suddenly unemployed and destitute. Compounding this were the devastating famines that swept the land and the crushing new tax systems imposed by the British that pushed peasant communities into ruin. Viewed through this lens, The men who joined these gangs were not, perhaps, devout followers of a divine command. They were laid-off soldiers, starving farmers, and desperate outcasts. For them, highway robbery was not a sacred duty. It was, as Wagner calls it, a highly institutionalized social practice for survival in a world that had left them with no other choice. They were not fanatics, they were the collateral damage of empire. But why then the elaborate stories of Kali, the omens, the consecrated pickaxe? This is where the colonial gaze becomes the protagonist of the story. The British did not see a socio-economic crisis. They saw what they expected to see in India, a land of exotic mystery, savage customs, and irrational, sanguinary deities. The idea of a secret death cult fit perfectly within their Orientalist fantasy of the East. And in Captain Sleeman, this fantasy found its perfect author. We must re-examine the approver's confessions, not as verbatim transcripts, but as desperate performances. Picture the scene. A captured man, gaunt and in chains, sits before a British officer who holds the absolute power of life and death. His former associates have already been hanged. He knows that a simple confession of robbery will lead him to the gallows. But he also sees what fascinates his captor, the rituals, the superstitions, the worship of the Dark Mother. The system created a perverse incentive. The more fantastical and religious the story, the more valuable the approver became. The prisoners began to tell Sleeman exactly what he wanted to hear, exaggerating or even inventing the ritualistic elements because they quickly learned that this was their only currency for survival. Sleeman, in turn, used these coerced, curated stories as objective proof, creating a perfect, self-reinforcing loop of confirmation bias. This colonial fiction was then supercharged into global fact by a single book. In 1839, Philip Meadows Taylor, a colonial administrator, published Confessions of a Thug. Presented as the true story of a captured thug, the novel was a runaway bestseller, an explosive cocktail of horror, adventure, and exoticism. It was this book, read by everyone from Queen Victoria to the clerks of London, that seared the image of the fanatical strangler into the Western imagination. The word thug entered the English language, forever associated with mindless, ritualistic violence. The complex reality was gone, replaced by a simple, terrifying, and wildly popular myth. And this myth had a terrible, lasting legacy. The idea that Thuggee was a hereditary trait, a moral stain passed down through generations, became the pseudo-scientific justification for one of the most monstrous pieces of legislation in the history of empire, the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. This act effectively declared that crime was a biological inheritance. Millions of people belonging to itinerant and marginalised communities were branded at birth as hereditary criminals. They were subjected to constant surveillance, their freedom of movement eliminated, their livelihoods destroyed. The myth created by Sleeman had become a weapon of social engineering, used to control and persecute entire populations for nearly a century. The hunt for a phantom cult had ended in the very real oppression of millions. In the end, we are left with the rumal, the yellow silk scarf. In the first story, the one told by the British, it is a tool of ritual murder, the symbol of a dark faith. But perhaps we have been looking at the wrong strangler all along. Perhaps the most effective act of strangulation was not performed on a dusty road, but in a quiet office, with a pen instead of a scarf. It was the strangling of a complex truth into a simple, useful lie. The story of the Thuggee is a chilling lesson in the anatomy of power. It shows us how history is not simply remembered, it is constructed. It is written by the victors, and it is a story they tell to legitimize their own actions. By painting the Thuggee as a demonic, irrational evil, the British Empire could cast itself as a heroic agent of civilization, bringing light to a dark land. It was the perfect justification for conquest. The official story wasn't just a record of events, it was an act of colonial domination. This forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. If a story this well documented, this accepted, this ingrained in our language can be a phantom, then what other histories can we truly trust? Whose voices were silenced to create the narratives we accept as fact? The tale of the Thuggee is a ghost that haunts our archives, a whisper that warns us to be critical of every official story, especially those that neatly divide the world into heroes and monsters, civilized and savage. It teaches us that the most dangerous myths are the ones that confirm our own superiority. The ultimate horror of this tale is not the image of a body being tipped into an unhallowed grave. It is the chilling realization that entire peoples can be buried under the weight of a story. They can be demonized, criminalized, and erased, not by a shadowy cult, but by the cold, bureaucratic machinery of those in power. The real monster is not the fanatic who kills in the name of a god, but the administrator who, with a stroke of his pen, can condemn millions in the name of order. And his legacy is all around us, reminding us that the most important and most difficult hunt is not for the secrets hidden in the darkness, but for the lies we have been taught to see as the light.